Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring mad science. The Wheel is Death by Roger D. Next Stop Nowhere by Dick Purcell. The Drug by C. MacApp. Toy Shop by Harry Harrison. World Atavism by Edmond Hamilton. The Wheel is Death by Roger D. Aycock, writing as Roger D. Originally published in Planet Stories Fall 1949. Narrated by Tom Trussel. He was too late to stop them. Old Calise dropped his upraised arm, and at his signal the 4 naked underpriests flung the bound body of Gorzan over the precipice. Otho heard his friend's thin scream keening away until it dwindled in the distance, and the muted roar of the falls boiling at the cliff's bottom floated upward and drowned it. He turned to run, but the horror of what he had seen numbed his limbs to nightmare slowness. Calise and the 4 underpriests caught him before he had taken a dozen steps. "You are still a neophyte," old Calise said gently. "You have only begun to learn, and so you cannot understand why Gorzan had to die. The answer lies there." He pointed a wrinkled hand at the valley below. Over the heads of the 4 priests who squatted on the ledge outside the priest cave, Otho looked down into the valley, the lush green miles of its even floor clothed in a faint rosy haze of vapour. The sun sat red upon the western wall. Above the eastern rim the rising moon hung warm and turquoise blue, its great encircling ring pulsing like an aura of living light. Under its glow, the valley haze turned violet and then blue, and on the heels of its rising came the faint elfin voices of the people, leaving their caves to play in the meadow. Otho sat back upon his polished sitting stone and met the high priest's eyes defiantly. "There is no reason down there," he said sullenly. "It is only the people coming out to play under the moon. You killed Gorzan because he was wiser than you, because he talked to the people and made clear to them things that they did not understand before. You were jealous of him, and you killed him lest he make your own wisdom seem small in the eyes of the people." Calise sighed and seated himself stiffly on his own sitting stone. "The young do not learn easily," he said, "but believe this, Otho. Your friend Gorzan was a snare to the people and a deadly menace to their way of life. We took him from them reluctantly, and only as a last resort, before he could start the people again on the bloody path of ambition, progress, and the machine." Otho cupped his still beardless chin in his hands and stared disconsolately down into the blue-hazed valley where the people played. "Empty talk," he said contemptuously. "Priest talk. Ambition. Progress. The machine. I do not know the words. There is nothing but the valley and the people, who have always been and who will always be. Your words have no meaning." "I have taught these others," Calise murmured. The blue moonlight pulsed warm across his wrinkled face, made his hooded eyes pools of reflected light. "I can teach you, too. You would know these things soon, because you are almost ready to read the books. But I shall tell you now, that you may not be rebellious for lack of understanding." He pointed again, this time at the moon with its restless blue halo. "It was not always so," he said. His voice softened as his memory drifted back across the ages. Once it was yellow, pitted and airless and dead, shining only with the light reflected from the sun. Men changed that, as they changed the face of their world by the power of their science, which in the end defeated the aims they strove for and destroyed them almost utterly. The handful that remained of them found haven in the valley and began a new civilization, which is today the people. This time, being wiser, they outlawed the practice of science. Under Khalid's calm assurance, Ortho's resentment dwindled, and his loathing of the high priest gave way to bewilderment. "Science?" he repeated. "It is another strange word. I do not understand." "In another age, Gorzan would have been a scientist," Khalid said. "I have seen them with my own eyes in the ancient days, puttering in tomb-like shops that shut other men away from them, denying all pleasure while they spent their lives improving what other scientists had already discovered. They were never satisfied, and in the end it was their insatiable lust for perfection that killed them, that set the very moon aflame and flung mankind back into the savagery from which it had risen. For there was a time," he went on somberly, shifting his sitting stone to follow Orthos's troubled gaze down into the blue depths of the valley, "long before my own, when men lived as simply as we, but without our peace and security. The world then was a savage place, full of frightful beasts which killed men for food because they were no more than weaker animals. Men, being weak and soft, sought communal safety in numbers, and gained an advantage over the beasts because they developed intelligence and logic by exchanging ideas and experiences. They learned to use this intelligence to develop weapons which eventually wiped out all the dangerous beasts and made the world safe. But they were not content with safety, and fought savagely among themselves. Nations numbering millions of men came into being and warred with each other, and with each war their ingenuity grew, and the deadliness of their weapons kept pace with their ingenuity." Khalid was quiet for a moment, listening to the faint laughter of the people that drifted up faintly from the valley floor. "Men were not happy then, as they are now," he said. "I remember them, Ortho, because I was one of them, and by a miracle escaped the great holocaust that destroyed mankind. Men had developed a weapon whose destructiveness was beyond the power of the mind to conceive, and it escaped control. Nation after nation died in a breath. Whole continents vanished under the impact of robot missiles whose explosions destroyed matter itself. One of these, perhaps by intent, struck the moon, and its reaction under the moon's lighter gravity set up a conflagration which never went out. Those of us who survived the Holocaust were greatly changed by the radiations of the explosions, and most of us soon died. I alone, by chance, was rendered deathless. More ages have passed than I can number, but I live on, perhaps eternally, to see that the people do not err and fall again into the trap with science with its machines would place in their way. Gorzan was a throwback to my own savage day, a natural scientist who believed nothing he was told, and reasoned with a deadly logic that nothing created by nature can be perfect, but must be improved by the thought and effort of man. Today we slew him, reluctantly, because he had taken the final irrevocable step that branded him a heretic and an outlaw. Gorzan made a machine." He stretched out a hand to Ortho, and they rose together, the abashed eyes of the neophyte not meeting those of the high priest. "Come," Khalid said, "and behold the thing with your own eyes. I have kept it intact to convince you beyond doubt of Gorzan's heresy." They went back into the priest cave, past the long tiers of books, crumbling and yellow with age, to stand in awed silence over the thing Gorzan had made. Ortho stared, shivering, feeling the cold aura of unsentient alien power that radiated from the machine. It was a crude affair, built upon two wooden shafts that slanted upward to end in a pair of rough handles. Across them were lashed shorter sticks that supported a woven basket. At the forward end was a thin disc made of wooden segments, a little wooden axle running through the center and holding the disc upright between the joined ends of the shafts. Gorzan, tired of making 2 trips to his cave with firewood and fruit, old Khalise said somberly. So he created a machine which would carry a greater load than his shoulders would bear. In my own age, the thing was called a wheelbarrow, but the name of it is not important now, because there will never be another. We will destroy it now, and with its destruction we will forget what Gorzan had rediscovered, which is the first principle of the machine that enslaved and then destroyed mankind, the wheel.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
Next stop, Nowhere, by Dick Purcell. Originally published in Imagination Stories of Science and Fantasy, August 1956. Narrated by Tom Trussel. 4 persons disappearing from an elevator should have caused concern, even excitement, especially when the elevator was stuck between 2 floors. But the thing was handled quite casually, and with good reason. After all, when a thing is not understood, the best defense against acknowledging ignorance is to insist that nothing extraordinary happened. In this case, 4 persons, a girl and 3 men, stepped into an elevator in the Kendall building. They were all headed for the same suite, offices occupied by several medical men. The elevator jammed between the 6th and 7th floors and refused to budge. The operator, a salty little Brooklynite, swore quietly to himself and pushed the emergency signal. It rang, but nothing happened. The operator waited for a few minutes, then spoke in a carefully casual voice. "The blessed engineer is out to supper. Now ain't that the way things always happens? When the blessed engineer goes out to supper, the blessed elevator does a blessed sit-down between 2 floors." What are we going to do?" This from the very pretty female passenger named Peggy Wilson, who was afraid of almost everything and was going to a psychiatrist who was trying to root a dominating mother out of the poor girl's subconscious and put the old lady back in her grave where she belonged. "We aren't in any danger, miss. We could wait for the engineer, but it might be quite a while." "It looks to me as though we'll have to wait for him," Walter Maltby said. Maltby was an ingrown little man who had a toothache for 3 weeks and had finally been driven to the dentist by his dominating wife. "Oh no, if one of you guys, men, will boost me through the trap in the roof of the car, I can get to the 7th floor door. I'll crawl out and go down in the basement and move the blessed car to 7 by hand." "Okay," Wilmer Peyton said. He was a 6'4" Greek god with a body close to perfection and a handsome, intelligent face that was nothing more than a spate of false advertising pasted across the front of a vacant head. Wilmer was pretty much of a mental bankrupt. He didn't even own the furniture in his own cerebral attic, the pieces having been placed there by others. He had the look of a rising young executive and was the assistant mailroom boy in a large publishing company, and a good one too. Lately, they had been entrusting him with special delivery letters. He braced himself and the operator climbed on his shoulders and vanished through the ceiling. A moment later there was the sound of an opening door and a few grunts and scramblings, after which the door closed and silence again prevailed. The three passengers glanced at each other fearfully. The fourth, a small white-haired man in his late 60s, had stood quietly in one corner during the whole procedure. He had a pair of bright black eyes and a look remindful of an alert fox terrier in a basement known to house rats. He was Fleming Carter, a psychiatrist by profession and a student of almost everything by choice. He was an accomplished linguist among other things, and translated Sanskrit and Hebrew for the pleasure of it. He was an amateur chemist, and also conducted himself ably on a pair of skis. So the quartet was not lacking in brilliance, Fleming Carter having enough to burnish all four. He had mentally taken his three fellow prisoners apart and put them together again when he noticed the girl's trembling and saw her first tears. Only then did he step forward. "There is no cause for alarm, my dear, none at all. These lifts fairly bristle with safety devices. The insurance companies demand it." Peggy Wilson turned to him gratefully. A little like a kitten, he thought, which yearned for the reassurance of a soothing hand. She would make a beautiful Persian, he thought. A perfect house pet. But to be trapped here, like animals, Peggy whimpered. "It's terrible." She was moving toward Fleming Carter's shoulder, but Wilma Peyton took a single step forward, and her head turned quite naturally to his bosom. Fleming Carter smiled, and estimated to a nicety the intelligence of any offspring that would result from a mating of these two vacuums. "It's all right, baby," Wilma said. "I'll take care of you." Walter Maltby had troubles of his own. He now voiced them. "Jenny will be furious if you don't get out of here pretty quick. I'm always home for television theatre, and if I don't make it—" He got no further, because at that moment the foundations of the world seemed to give way, and the four of them were hurled into a heap on the floor. Or were they? This question was in Fleming Carter's mind as Peggy Wilson screamed, Walter Maltby whimpered, and Wilma Peyton bellowed in terror. Had the lift fallen? The building collapsed? An atom bomb exploded? His instincts told him no. This because, while all the outward manifestations of such catastrophe seemed apparent, there was something strangely different about the sudden chaos into which the group had been thrown. Fleming Carter felt they should all be dead, but they remained very much alive. They should have been at least mangled and maimed. None appeared even scratched. All this, Carter told himself firmly, was a chaos of the mind, and nothing more. It was mental panic of such violence that it was manifesting in the physical. He told himself this while he sought to maintain equilibrium while standing upon nothing, and wondering where such a terrific wind would come from in a sheltered elevator shaft. Then it was over. The hurricane subsided. The floor stiffened beneath them, and they were lying in a heap. A heap made interesting by Peggy Wilson's legs sprawled above the others in a very unladylike manner. Wilma Peyton groaned. "Shut up," Fleming Carter said sharply. "Don't start a wave of panic and hysteria. You aren't hurt." "How the hell do you know I ain't?" Wilma Peyton demanded with childlike docility. "Because I'm not, and no one else seems to be, and we're all fell the same distance." Fleming Carter began to extricate himself from the pack. This necessitated pressing rather personally against Peggy Wilson. He did what he had to do, and then drew the girl's skirt down as gently and hastily as possible. He was relieved to find she was in no shape to care what anyone did with her skirt. Meanwhile, the elevator operator, upon finding he could not move the elevator, returned to reassure the occupants. He went to the 7th floor and called down very cheerily, "Everything's all right, folks. If this had happened before 6 o'clock, there'd be plenty of blessed people around, but it's almost 7, and the engineer ain't back from supper yet. Won't be but a little while, though, and then—" The operator became aware that only silence answered him. Had they been scared dumb? "You! Hey you! Down there!" More silence. The operator frowned and crawled down into the shaft. He looked through the trap. Empty. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, and because an obvious situation was covered by an obvious answer, added, "All 4 of them crawled out and went home. Funny they couldn't stick around a few minutes." He did not ponder the difficulties involved in such an escape. The only direction they could have gone was up and out on the 7th floor. He thus accepted the obvious, and his only thought on the subject was that he'd like to have been the one to boost the girl up. Later, he bawled the engineer out, and that was that, as far as he was concerned. But the situation was far less simple for the 4 passengers. As Fleming Carter struggled to his feet, Walter Maltby used his leg for a ladder and became erect also and said, "I'll bet Jenny will sue somebody for this. Jenny won't let them get away with it, not for a minute." Wilmer Peyton was also on his feet, looking dully about him. Fleming Carter said, "Why don't you help the lady, young man? I'm sure she would appreciate the courtesy from you more than myself, or—" He looked questioningly at the other male member of the quartet. "Walter Maltby, and as I was saying, Jenny will never—" "I'm sure she won't." "What happened?" Wilmer Peyton asked of no one in particular as he hauled Peggy Wilson to her feet. The girl was biting her lip, trying hard to be brave. "The elevator must have fallen. It's a wonder we weren't all killed." They agreed. All save Fleming Carter, who was looking around with bright interest. "It seems to me that we are no longer in the elevator." Walter Maltby's jaw dropped. "No longer in the—" "This is a somewhat larger area, and I fail to see any walls. Also, the ceiling seems to have vanished." The other 3 gazed about in shocked silence, and the truth of Fleming Carter's statements dawned on them. No walls, no ceiling. Nothing but hard earth under their feet and a high blue sky above. "Why, we're out in the country," Peggy Wilson babbled. "I agree," Fleming Carter said, "but let's not get panicky. We're still alive and unhurt." "But I don't understand it," Walter Maltby said plaintively. "I just don't understand it." Fleming Carter regarded the little man with pity. No Jenny around to reassure the little man with her domineering bulk. Carter knew as a matter of course that Jenny would be both bulky and domineering. Carter looked about him. They were out in open country, that was obvious. There was a huge sun and a huge blue sky and huge clouds floating overhead. Everything in place, but something very wrong. Things were just too big. That was it, Carter told himself. The size of this new world was far out of proportion to the size of him and his new friends. They were all standing in coarse grass that reached their knees. High grass. But Carter realized instantly that the grass was not high. They themselves were short. Wilmer Peyton, holding Peggy Wilson in the crook of one arm, looked about through eyes that obviously sent no intelligence messages to his brain. He turned them on Carter and said, "I don't get any of this." "I think I know what happened," Carter said. This even caught the interest of Walter Maltby, who was wondering what Jenny would have to say about his not arriving home on schedule. "What did happen?" "We've fallen, or were snatched, through some sort of space-time warp." Wilmer Peyton gaped idiotically and said, "We did which? Through a what?" Fleming Carter seemed not to hear. He was staring pensively at the thick blades of grass that brushed his knees. "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio," he mused. "There ain't nobody here named Horatio," Wilmer said suddenly. Excuse me, my mind was wandering." Carter's mind was not wandering at all, however. He said, "There are certain unexplained phenomena that are believed to have happened in our world. People have been known to disappear mysteriously, and those who remain behind formulate theories as to the how and the why of their vanishing. It is believed by some that people can be moved under certain conditions from one plane of existence to another, that there are many of these so-called planes of existence where many and varied peoples live and breathe upon them. Of course, no proof has ever been found for these theories, because the vanished persons never came back to testify. But—" Carter stopped suddenly and regarded the three with a touch of compassion. "You haven't the least idea what I'm talking about, do you?" "I'm afraid not," Walter Maltby said timidly. "Well, never mind. Perhaps I don't either. In any case, existence is its own excuse for accepting any locale. Suffice it to say, we are now in a world that has not built for us, a world for creatures of far greater dimensions than ourselves, and how we got here is really of little importance." Peggy Wilson was now snugly in Wilma Peyton's arms, her head tight against his chest. Wilma was just opening his mouth to say something when, over the slope of the land, a huge form appeared. There was nothing mystifying about it. The creature was obviously a man. He wore rather strange, loose clothing that, Carter thought, had some resemblance to those of the ancient Greeks, but otherwise there was nothing different about him except his size. As he approached, Fleming Carter estimated that Wilma Peyton, the tallest of the four, would come about to the top of this odd sandal-like footgear. There was no panic now, the three being completely frozen with terror, and Carter statue quiet and sharply alert. The giant, he was sure, would pass within 200 yards of them, a distance dangerously close considering the man's size. Still, Carter was optimistic. There was no reason why the giant should see them. As things were, they would certainly hope to be overlooked. But Peggy Wilson dashed this hope as the pressure within her became too strong to contain and broke out in the form of a scream. The giant stopped, took a few quick steps in their direction, and was upon them. Carter knew then that they were lost. A huge hand swooped down and lifted Walter Maltby into the air. Far above, Carter saw the terrified Maltby being transferred carefully to the giant's other hand. Now Wilma Peyton and Peggy Wilson were running blindly in two directions, Peggy having been suddenly deserted by her protector. Twice more the huge hand descended, and the two also vanished into the vast palm. Apparently the giant overlooked Fleming Carter, who had stood quite still during the whole time. But Carter made a swift decision based more on charity than good sense. Somehow he could not leave those three to their fate, so he cried out and waved his arms. "Just a moment, you overlooked me!" The hand swooped down again as the giant saw him. Carter Fleming found himself resting comfortably with his face against someone's back. Otherwise, he was completely surrounded by soft flesh. He realized they were being handled carefully, however, so he felt that death, while definitely a threat, had been at least postponed. He wondered about the others, so close to him, and yet so far away, so far as contact was concerned. He knew the terror that raced through their minds, and he pitied them. The giant was continuing on, Carter decided, and he endured the ride as best he could. Then it terminated suddenly, as Carter and the others were very gently tumbled into a room. The room had no ceiling, but this situation was speedily remedied when a seedling was lowered and set into place above them. In the resulting darkness, Carter heard Peggy Wilson sobbing and various unintelligible noises from Maltby and Peyton. Then the room began suddenly to move in haphazard directions. Possibly this was finally the end, but Fleming Carter could not bring himself to think so. Because even though the room pitched and tossed, Carter felt it was being done rather gently by the giant hands. Then it was over. The room settled down and remained on solid base. Immediately there was a rending sound, and a vast finger was thrust through the wall just below ceiling level. The finger was withdrawn, but only to reappear when thrust through the other side. It vanished again, and the two resulting holes let in ample air and light. For a few moments Carter and the others sat motionless, waiting. Something was going on outside the room itself moving slightly, but the violent tossing was evidently over. Peggy Wilson spoke first, or rather sobbed, "Where are we?" "I'm sure I don't know, my dear, but if I stood on the young man's shoulders I could look out through one of those openings and perhaps learn a little something." "You want me to lift you?" Wilmer Peyton said dully. "That is the general idea," Carter replied in a gentle voice. Wilmer braced himself against the wall, and Carter clambered to his shoulders and cautiously pushed his head through the opening. He remained thus for quite a while, until Wilmer Peyton began moving restlessly. Then he clambered down. They waited for him to speak, but he said nothing. He stared at the hole with a look of amazement upon his face, as though, for the first time, the wonder of this strange transition had struck him forcibly. Then he turned his eyes upon his three companions, and there was a look in his eyes that had not been there before. Personal, yet impersonally analytical. A hard look to read, so he could have no way of knowing that he was trying to forecast how they would react to the fate that awaited them. "Well," Wilmer Peyton demanded impatiently, "did you see anything?" "Yes, this is not a room. It is a huge box of some sort. It is bound around on all sides by what looks like red carpeting out of width used in hallways. I believe such carpetings are called runners. Attached to the top is a large white sail, although it appears to be made of paper rather than canvas." He was watching them closely as he spoke. "It took you all that time to see those things?" Walter Maltby asked a trifle plaintively. "No, there were other things." At this point Peggy Wilson, coming out of her shock, began to cry hysterically, "My God, what's to become of us? We'll all be killed, murdered." "I don't think so," Carter said. "Then we'll be held prisoner. That will be just as bad." "In a sense, you will be held prisoner, but I don't think it will be bad. I think our jailer will probably be a rather kindly person who will give us every consideration." "How could a jailer do that?" Peggy Wilson moaned. Carter laid a hand upon her shoulder. "Consider, my dear, all your life you had needed a mother. Now you will have the equivalent of one." He turned to Walter Maltby. "And you have learned to function only as a result of a dominating wife's promptings. Our jailer will fill that role for you." Lastly, he regarded Wilmer Peyton. "You, young man, will be directed and guided. You will not have need of the brain power with which you are not equipped. All of you will be content. None will have any decisions to make. All will be taken care of. Can you think of a more pleasant destiny?" Walter Maltby said, "You're talking in circles, talking but not saying anything." Carter had turned away, smiling. "This is very strange. We were transported to another plane, but not snatched up willy-nilly. There was a pattern behind it. 3 people admirably suited to their new fate." Wilmer Peyton seized Fleming Carter by the arm and whirled him around. "Will you please tell us what you're talking about?" "Of course," Carter said quietly. "To speak the absolute truth, we are in a box. The box is tied with a wide red ribbon. The thing I called a sail is in reality a greeting card upon which certain words are written, words not too difficult to decipher." Well, go on. What are the words? In English, they would read, Happy birthday, darling. You are someone's birthday present. Peggy's face was ashen. You speak of us, she whispered. How well suited we are for this fate. What about yourself? Carter smiled. I expect this to be the most interesting period of my life, he said. You see, the present is for me. I picked it out. And as they watched in stunned amazement, Carter began to grow.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story.
The Drug by C.C. MacApp. Originally published in Galaxy Magazine, February 1961. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Amos Parry, a regional manager for Whelan Inc., Farm and Ranch Chemicals and Feeds, had come to work a few minutes early and was waiting in the lab when Frank Barnes arrived. He saw that the division's chief chemist was even more nervous than usual, so he invested a few minutes in soothing small talk before saying, Frank, sales is beginning to push for that new hormone. Immediately Barnes came unsoothed. Bill Detrick was on the phone about it yesterday, Mr. Parry. I'm sorry I was abrupt with him. Amos grinned. If you were, he hasn't had a chance to mention it to me yet, but I think we'd better light a fire under the thing. We'll probably get a blast from Buffalo before long. How many men do you have on it? Well, 2 helping with routine work, but I've done most of it myself, evenings and weekends. I didn't want anybody to know too much about it, Mr. Parry. I'm worried about it. Worried? How do you mean? Well, let me show you the litter we've been testing it on. The pigs were in pens outside the lab. Amos had seen figures on weight gain and general health. The latter was what promised to be sensational, but hadn't seen the animals for 2 weeks. He eyed the first bunch. How old is that boar pig? Not quite 4 months. Amos was no expert, but he'd spent many hours on customers' farms, and he thought the animal looked more mature than that. So did the shoats in the same pen, though they tended more to fat. All of the group had an odd look, certainly not normal for Yorkshires of their age. He thought of wild hogs. Is it just the general health factor? He asked. I don't think so, Mr. Parry. You remember I told you this wasn't actually a hormone. I know. You wanted to call it that for secrecy, you told me. Yes, sir, but I didn't tell you what it really was. Mr. Parry, are you familiar with hypnotics? Mescaline especially. No, I'm not, Frank. Well, it's a drug that causes strong hallucinations. This is a chemical derivative of it. Amos grinned again. Pipe dreams for hogs? He quit grinning as implication struck him. If this thing didn't pan out after the money they'd spent and the rumours that had been seeped out, there'd be some nasty questions from Buffalo. And if it did, and they began selling it... What would it do to human beings? Asked Amos. Barnes avoided his eyes. That's one of the things I'm worried about, he said. I want to show you another pig. This one was isolated in its own pen, and it looked even stranger than its siblings. In the first place, its hair was thicker and black. There was an oddness in its shape, and a vaguely familiar sinuousness in the way it moved that made Amos's skin prickle. What's wrong with it? He asked. It's healthy, except for the way it looks and acts. Same litter and dosage? Yes, sir. All of them got just 1 dose. The effects seemed to be permanent. They were leaning over the fence, and the animal was looking up at them. There was an oddity in its eyes. Not intelligence exactly, but something unpig-like. Abruptly it stood up on its hind legs, putting its forefeet against the fence and raising its head toward them. It squealed as if begging for attention. Amos knew that pigs made affectionate pets. Drawn to it as well as repelled, he reached down and patted it, and the squealing stopped. It was standing too easily in that position, and suddenly Amos recognized what was familiar about it. He jerked his hand away, feeling a strong desire for soap and water. How long's it been this way? It's changed fast in the last week. Amos looked toward the doorway of the lab, just inside of which a large black tomcat sat watching them. "Is the cat out here a lot?" Barnes' eyes went to the cat, widened, and turned back to the pig. He looked as ill as Amos felt. When Amos got to his office, his sales manager was already waiting. His mind only half present, Amos sized up the stuffed briefcase and the wider-than-necessary smile as he responded automatically to the amenities. "Just get back?" he asked. "Early train. Darned plane's grounded again." Detrick looked full of energy, though he'd undoubtedly rushed home, shaved, showered, and changed, and hurried to the office with no rest. He sat down, extracted papers from the briefcase, and beamed. "Wrote up the Peach Association." "He'll give me the good news first," Amos thought. "Fine, fine," he said. "The whole year?" "Yep. Got a check from the almond growers, too. All paid up now." "Good," said Amos, and waited. It came. "Say, I was talking to Frank Barnes about that new hormone he's got, and he seemed a little negative about it. When do you think we can have it?" It was a temptation to answer with false optimisms and duck the issue for a while, but Amos said, "The slowest thing will be state and federal testing and registration. I'd say not less than a year." Detrick nodded. "Competition's selling more and more stuff that's not registered. Fly-by-night outfits, and they're always getting caught." Detrick smiled. "Every night they fly away with more business." Amos managed a smile, though the argument was old and weary. "We'll put it up to Buffalo if you want to, Bill. You know I can't okay it myself." Detrick dropped the subject, not being a man to beat his head against a stone wall if there were ways around it, and for the next hour Amos had to listen to the troubles. Competition had cut prices on this, upped active ingredients and that, put such and such a new product on the market. Whelan's factories and warehouses already groaned under a crippling diversity of products, but sales didn't feel that was their problem. And even the credit policies needed revising. But the worst of all was a $15,000 claim for damage to pear trees caused by a bad batch of Whelan's arsenical insecticide. Amos got rid of Detrick with a few definite concessions, some tentative ones, and some standoffs. He made sure no one was waiting to see him and told his secretary he didn't want to be bothered before lunch. He had a lunch date with a customer and dreaded it. It meant 3 or 4 highballs, and overeating, and an upset stomach later. Before then, though, he had a few minutes to try to get his mind straightened out. He mixed a glassful of the stuff he was supposed to take about now. The complete executive, he thought, with physician and prescription attached. It didn't seem possible that this same body had once breezed through anything from football to fried potatoes. Mechanically, his mind on the lab's pigs, he got a small bag of grain out of a desk drawer. He hoped nobody, except his secretary, of course, knew he wasted time feeding pigeons. But it helped his nerves, and he felt he had a right to 1 or 2 eccentricities. They were already waiting. Some of them knew him and didn't shoo off when he opened the window and scattered grain on the ledge outside. A few ate from his hand. It was a crisp day, but the sun slanting into the window was warm. He leaned there, watching the birds. More were circling in now, and looking out over the industrial part of the city. The rude shapes were softened by haze, and there was nothing noisy close by. He could almost imagine it as some country landscape. He looked at his watch, sighed, pulled his head in, and shut the window. The air conditioner's hiss replaced the outside sounds. Not even imagination could get rid of the city for long. Going through the outer office, he saw that Alice Grant, his secretary, already had her lunch out on her desk. She was a young 30, not very tall, and just inclined to plumpness. She wore her blonde hair pulled back into a knot that didn't succeed in making her look severe, and her features were well formed and regular, if plain. Amos noticed a new bruise on one cheek, and wondered how long she'd stay with her sot of a husband. There were no children to hold her. "I'll probably be back late," he said. "Anything for this afternoon?" "Just Jim at 2:30 and the union agent at 3. The lunch didn't go too badly, lubricated as the customer liked it, and Amos was feeling only hazily uneasy when he got back. A stormy session with his plant superintendent jarred him into the normal disquiet. Jim Glover was furious at having to take the $15,000 claim, though it was clearly a factory error. He also fought a stubborn delaying action before giving Amos a well-hedged estimate of $50,000 to equip for the new drug. He complained that Frank Barnes hadn't given him enough information. Amos was still trembling from that encounter when the union business agent arrived. The lunch was beginning to lump up, and it didn't spar effectively. Not that it made much difference. The union was going to have a raise, or else. By the time he'd squirmed through that interview, then dictated a few letters, it was time to go home. He hoped his wife would be out, so he could take some of his prescription and relax, but she met him at the door with a verbal barrage. Their son, nominally a resident of the house, had gotten ticketed with the college crowd for drunken driving, and Amos was to get it fixed. The Templetons were coming for the weekend. Her brother's boy was graduating and thought he might accept a position with Amos. She paused and studied him. "I hope this isn't one of your grumpy evenings. The Ashtons are coming for bridge." His control slipped a little, and he expressed himself pungently on Wednesday night bridge, after a nightclub party on Tuesday and a formless affair at somebody's house on Monday. She stared at him without compassion or comprehension. "Well, they're all business associates of yours. I wonder where you think you'd be without a wife who was willing to entertain." He'd been getting a lot of that lately. She was squeezing the role of executive's wife for the last drop of satisfaction. Well, since he couldn't relax with his indigestion, there was only one thing to do. He headed for the bar. "Now don't get tipsy before dinner," she called after him. He got through the evening well enough, doused with martinis, and the night that followed was no worse than most. At 9 the next morning, the call he'd been expecting from Buffalo came through. "Hello, Stu," he said to the president of the company. "Hello, Amos. Still morning out there, eh? How's the family? Good. Say, Amos, couple of things. This big factory charge. Production screaming." It was definitely a bad batch, Stu. "Well, that's it then. Question is, how did it happen?" "Jim Glover says he needs another control chemist." "Hope you're not practicing false economy out there." "We wanted to hire another man, Stu, but Buffalo turned it down." "You should have brought it to me personally if it was that important. It's going to take a big bite out of your year's profit. Been able to get your margin up any?" Amos didn't feel up to pointing out that sales wanted lower prices and the union wanted higher wages, so that the margin would get even worse. He described a couple of minor economies he's been able to find, and mentioned the contract with the Peach Association. "Yes, I heard about that," said the president of the company. "Nice piece of business. By the way, how are you coming on that animal hormone?" That was the main reason for the call, of course. Detrick had undoubtedly phoned east and intimated that Amos was dragging his feet on a potential bonanza. "I was going to call you on that, Stu. It'll take a year to test and get registered and—" Amos, I hope you're not turning conservative on us. The message was plain. Amos countered automatically. You know me better than that, Stu. It's the legal department I'm worried about. If they set up a lot of roadblocks, we may need you to run interference. You know I'm always right behind you, Amos. That's true, thought Amos as he hung up. Right behind me. A hell of a place to run interference. He knew exactly what to expect. If he tried to cut corners, the legal department would scream about proper testing and registration. Production would say he was pushing Jim Glover unreasonably, and everyone who could would assume highly moral positions astraddle the fence. A ton of paperwork would go to Buffalo to be distributed among 50 desks and expertly stalled. Not to mention that this was no ordinary product. He realized for the first time that the government might not let him produce it, let alone sell it, even as a minute percentage in feeds. If it was a narcotic, it could be misused. His buzzer sounded, and he was surprised when Mrs. Grant announced Frank Barnes. It was out of character for Frank not to make a formal appointment first. One look told Amos what was coming. He listened to Frank's resignation with a fraction of his mind, while the rest of it mused upon the purposeful way things were converging. Barnes stopped talking, and Amos said mechanically, "You've been part of the team for a long time, Frank. It's especially awkward to lose you just now." It was banal, but it didn't matter. He wasn't going to change the man's mind anyway. He looked closer. The timidity was gone. So were the eyeglasses. A frightening thought struck him. "You've taken some of that drug." Barnes grinned and handed a small vial full of powder across the desk, along with a file folder. "Last night," he said, "between frustration with the job and curiosity about this stuff, I yielded to temptation." Amos took the vial and folder. "What are these for?" "So you can destroy them if you want to. I've doctored up the lab records to make the whole thing look like a false alarm. You're holding all that's left of the whole program." Amos looked for signs of irrationality and saw none. "Do you feel all right?" "Better than you can imagine. But let me tell you what you're up against. I can at least do that for you, Mr. Barry." "Thanks. Don't you suppose you could call me Amos now?" "Sure, Amos. First of all, you were right about that pig trying to imitate the cat. He couldn't do much because he only had a pig's brain to work with." He stopped and grinned, evidently at Amos's expression. "I'll try to explain. What is an animal? Physically, I mean." Amos shook his head. "You've got the floor." "All right. An animal is a colony of cells. Different kinds of cells form organs and do different things for the colony, but each cell has a life of its own, too. When it dies, a new one of the same kind takes over. But what regulates the colony? What maintains the pattern?" Amos waited. "Part of it's automatic replacement, cell for cell. But beyond that, there's a control, and it's the unconscious mind." He paused and studied Amos. "You think I'm theorizing. I'm not. That drug broke down some barriers, and I see all this as you see your own fingers moving." Amos remembered the mention of hallucinations. Barnes grinned again. "Let's say it's only 1% awake and walled off from the conscious mind. What would happen if something removed the wall and woke up the other 99%? Remembering the pig, it was impossible not to feel a cold seal of belief. Amos dreaded what was coming next. Clearly, it would be a demonstration. Barnes held out his hand, palm up. In a few seconds, a pink spot appeared. It turned red, oozed dismayingly, and became a small pool of blood. Barnes let it stay for a moment, then wiped it off with a handkerchief. There was no more bleeding. "That's something I can do fast," he said. I opened the pores, directed blood to them, then closed them again. "Amos, do you believe in werewolves?" Amos wanted to jump up and shout, "No, you're insane," but he could only sit, staring. "I could move that thumb around to the other side of my hand," Barnes said thoughtfully. "I'm still exploring, but I don't think even the bone would take too long. You'll notice I don't need glasses anymore." The buzzer buzzed. Amos jumped, and from habit answered. "Bill Detrick and that customer are here, Mr. Parry," came Alice Grantz's voice. "I ask them to wait," he managed. His mind was a muddle. He needed time. "You, Frank, will you stay for a few days?" "Sure. I'm in no hurry now. And while you're thinking, let me give you a few hints. No more cripples or disease. No ugly people, unless they choose to be. And no law." "No law? How would you police such a world? A man could change his face at will, or his fingerprints, even his teeth. Probably he could do things I can't imagine yet." The buzzer went again, with Mrs. Grant's subtle urgency. Amos ignored it, yet he hardly knew when Frank left the room. He realized the chemist had done him a favor. The selfish thing would have been to keep the secret and the boon all to himself. Instead, he'd given Amos the choice. But what was the choice? Suppressing the drug would cost him his job. There was no doubt about that. He was standing with his back to the door when he heard it open. He turned and faced Detrick's annoyed frown. "Amos, we can't keep this man waiting. He's—" All of Amos's frustration and the new burden coalesced into rage. He ran toward Detrick. "You baboon-faced huckster!" he yelled. "Get out! Get out! I'll tell you when you can come in here!" He barely caught his upraised fist in time. Detrick stood petrified, his face ludicrous. Then he came to life, ducked out, and pulled the door shut behind him. Amos waited no longer. If he had to decide, he wanted the data first hand. He spread out the file Barnes had left him and looked through it for dosages. Apparently it wasn't critical, so he poured a little of the powder into a tumbler, added water, and threw it down. There was a mild alkaline taste, which he washed out of his mouth with more water. Then he sat down to wait. A monotone seemed to be rattling off trivia, almost faster than he could grasp it, even though it was in his head and not in his ears. Paris green, calcium acetoacetate, beetle invasion, Texan, cotton, paint pigment, obsolete, should eliminate, compensation claim, man probably faking infection, Detrick likes because we only source, felt like him hitting him when he argued about it, correspondence buffalo last year, they say keep, check how uses poison, damned wife. The last thought shocked his intellect awake. "Hey," intellect demanded, "what's going on here?" "Oh, you're broken through," said unconscious. "That was fast. 15 minutes and 23 seconds since you drank it. Probable error, 1/3 second. I've only been awake a few minutes myself. Minutes 60 per hour, 24 hours a day, days getting shorter. September, have raincoat in car. Wife wants new car. Raincoat sweats plasticizer, stinks, Hyatt used camphor." "Hold up a minute," cried intellect. "You want me to stop scanning?" "Is that what you're doing? Scanning what?" "Memory banks, of course. Don't you remember the book we read 3 years ago? Human brain estimated. Oh, all right, I'll slow down. You could follow me better if you'd let me grow some permanent direct connections." "Am I stopping you?" "Well, not you exactly. I'll show you." Unconscious began directing the growth of certain nerve tendrils in the brain. Amos could only follow it vaguely. "Fear!" screamed a soundless voice. "Stop!" "What was that?" intellect asked, startled. "That was id. He always fights any improvement, and I can't override him." "Can I?" Of course, that's mainly what you're for. Wait till I get these connections finished and you'll see the whole setup. Fear! Shrieked Id. Stop! No change! Shut up! Yelled Intellect. It was strange being integrated. Amos found he was aware on 2 levels simultaneously. While he responded normally to his external environment, a lightning inner vision saw everything in vastly greater detail. The blink of an eye, for instance, was an amazing project. Even as commands flashed out and before the muscles started to respond, extra blood was rushing into the area to nourish the working parts. Reports flowed back like battle assessments. These 3 muscles were on schedule. This was lagging. That was pulling too hard. An infinitesimal twinge of pain marked some minor accident, and correction began at once. A sensor watched the whole operation and labeled each incoming report. Trivial, do not record. Trivial, do not record. Trivial, do not record. Worth watching, record in temporary banks. Trivial, do not. He felt now that he could look forward to permanent health, and so far he didn't seem to be losing his identity or becoming a moral monster, though certain previously buried urges, toward Alice Grant for instance, were now rather embarrassingly uncovered. He was not, like Frank Barnes, inclined to slip out of the situation at once. He still felt the responsibility to make the decision. He carried the vial of powder and the lab records home with him, smuggled them past his wife's garrulity, for it didn't bother him now, and hid them. Went out with her cheerfully to visit some people he didn't like, and found himself amused at them instead of annoyed. In general, he felt buoyant, and they stayed quite late. When they did get home, an urgent message was waiting on the telephone recorder, and it jolted him. He grabbed up the hat and coat he'd just laid down. "What is it?" his wife demanded. "I've got to go down to the plant," he hesitated. It was hard to say the words that were charged with personal significance. "The watchman found Frank Barnes dead in the laboratory." "Who? Frank Barnes, my chief chemist." "Oh!" She looked at him, obviously concerned only with what effect, if any, it might have on her own circumstances. "Why do you have to get mixed up in it?" "I'm the boss, damn it." He left her standing there and ran for the garage. The police were already at the plant when he arrived. Fred's body lay on the floor of his office, in a corner behind some file cabinets, face up. "What was it?" Amos asked the man from the coroner's office, dreading the answer he expected. The answer wasn't the one he expected. "Heart attack." Amos wondered if they were mistaken. He looked around the office. Things weren't disarrayed in any way. It looked as if Frank had simply lain down and died. "When did you find him?" he asked the watchman. "A little after 1. The door was closed and the lights were out, but I heard the cat yowling in here, so I came in to let it out and saw the body." "Any family?" one of the city men asked. "No," said Amos slowly. "He lived alone. I guess you might as well take him to the morgue. When can I call about the autopsy?" "Try after lunch." Amos watched them carry Frank away. Then he put out the lights and closed up the laboratory. He told the watchman he'd be around for a while and went to his office to think. As nearly as he knew, Frank had taken the drug less than 24 hours before he had. Death had come late at night, which meant Frank had been working overtime. Why? And why hadn't he been able to save himself? "Not logical," his unconscious stated firmly. "He should have felt it coming and made repairs." "This whole thing's a delusion," said Amos dully, aloud. "No, it isn't," said a peculiar voice behind him. He whirled and saw the black tomcat grinning up at him. He gasped, wondering if he were completely insane, but in a flash understanding came. "Frank!" "Well, don't act so surprised. I can tell that you took some yourself." "Yes, but how?" "I thought it would be an easy life, and I want to stay around here and watch things for a while. It ought to be fun." "But how?" "I anesthetized the cat and grew a bridge into his skull. It took 5 hours to transfer the bulk of my personality. It's odd, but it blended right in with his." "But your speech—" "I've made some changes. I'm omnivorous now, too, not just carnivorous, or will be in a few more hours. I can go into the hills and live on grass, or grow back into a man, or whatever I like." Amos consulted his own inwardness again. "Is this possible? Can a human mind be compressed into a cat's brain?" "Sure," said Unconscious, "if you're willing to junk all the excess." He thought about it. "So you're going to stay around and watch," he said to the cat. "No, Frank. An intriguing idea. My family's taken care of, and nobody'll really miss me." "Except Alice Grant," said Frank cattily. "I've seen the way you look at her. The cat part of me has, I mean. And she looks back, too, when you aren't watching." "Well," said Amos, maybe we can do something there, too." His own metamorphosis took a lot longer than 5 hours. He had a much bigger job of alterations to finish. It was nearly 2 months before he got back to the plant. He peered in through the window at Detrick, who had inherited Amos's old office. Detrick was chewing out a salesman. Amos knew what would be happening now. Detrick's ambitious but unsound expansion would have gotten the division all tangled up. In fact, with his sharp new eyes, Amos could read part of a letter from Buffalo that lay on the desk. It was quite critical of Detrick's margin of profit. The salesman Detrick had on the carpet was a good man, and Amos wondered if he was to blame for whatever it was about. Maybe Detrick was just preparing to throw him to the wolves. A man could hang on a long time like that, shifting the blame to his subordinates. The salesman was finally excused, and Detrick sat alone with all the frustration and selfish scheming plain on his face. No, Amos thought, I'm not going to turn this drug loose on the world for a while. Not while there are people like Detrick around. There were no other pigeons on the window ledge except himself and Alice. The rest had stopped coming when Amos disappeared and the feeding ended. For that matter, they tended to avoid him and Alice, possibly because of the abnormal size, especially around the head, and the other differences. He noticed that Alice was changing the colour of her feet again, just like a woman, he thought fondly. "Come on, pigeon," he said, "let's go somewhere else. This tightwad Detrick isn't going to give us anything to eat."
The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story. Toy Shop by Harry Harrison. Originally published in Analog, April 1962. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Because there were few adults in the crowd, and Colonel Biff Horton stood over 6 feet tall, he could see every detail of the demonstration. The children, and most of the parents, gaped in wide-eyed wonder. Biff Horton was too sophisticated to be awed. He stayed on because he wanted to find out what the trick was that made the gadget work. "It's all explained right here in your instruction book," the demonstrator said, holding up a garishly printed booklet opened to a 4-colored diagram. "You all know how magnets pick up things, and I bet you even know that the Earth itself is one great big magnet. That's why compasses always point north. Well, the Atomic Wonder Space Wave Tapper hangs on to those space waves. Invisibly all about us, and even going right through us, are the magnetic waves of the Earth. The atomic wonder rides these waves just the way a ship rides the waves in the ocean. Now watch." Every eye was on him as he put the gaudy model rocket ship on top of the table and stepped back. It was made of stamped metal and seemed as incapable of flying as a can of ham, which it very much resembled. Neither wings, propellers, nor jets broke through the painted surface. It rested on 3 rubber wheels, and coming out through the bottom was a double strand of thin insulated wire. This white wire ran across the top of the black table and terminated in a control box in the demonstrator's hand. An indicator light, a switch and a knob appeared to be the only controls. "I turn on the power switch, sending a surge of current to the waved receptors," he said. The switch clicked, and the light blinked on and off with a steady pulse. Then the man began to slowly turn the knob. "A careful touch on the wave generator is necessary, as we are dealing with the powers of the whole world here." A concerted "ah" swept through the crowd as the space wave tapper shivered a bit, then rose slowly into the air. The demonstrator stepped back, and the toy rose higher and higher, bobbing gently on the invisible waves of magnetic force that supported it. Ever so slowly, the power was reduced, and it settled back to the table. "Only $17.95, the young man said, putting a large price sign on the table, "for the complete set of the Atomic Wonder, the Space Tapper control box, battery, and instruction book." At the appearance of the price card, the crowd broke up noisily, and the children rushed away towards the operating model trains. The demonstrator's words were lost in their noisy passage, and after a moment he sank into a gloomy silence. He put the control box down, yawned, and sat on the edge of the table. Colonel Horton was the only one left after the crowd had moved on. "Could you tell me how this thing works?" the colonel asked, coming forward. The demonstrator brightened up and picked up one of the toys. "Well, if you look here, sir," he opened the hinged top, "you will see the space wave coils at each end of the ship." With a pencil he pointed out the odd-shaped plastic forms about an inch in diameter that had been wound, apparently at random, with a few turns of copper wire. Except for these coils, the interior of the model was empty. The coils were wired together, and other wires ran out through the hole in the bottom of the control box. Biff Horton turned a very quizzical eye on the gadget and upon the demonstrator, who completely ignored this sign of disbelief. "Inside the control box is the battery," the young man said, snapping it open and pointing to an ordinary flashlight battery. "The current goes through the power switch and power light to the wave generator." "What you mean to say," Biff broke in, "is that the juice from this 15-cent battery goes through this cheap rheostat to those meaningless coils in the model, and absolutely nothing happens. Now tell me what really flies the thing. If I'm going to drop $18 for 6 bits worth of tin, I want to know what I'm getting." The demonstrator flushed. "I'm sorry, sir," he stammered. "I wasn't trying to hide anything. Like any magic trick, this one can't be really demonstrated until it has been purchased." He leaned forward and whispered confidentially. "I'll tell you what I'll do, though. This thing is way overpriced and hasn't been moving at all. The manager said I should let them go at $3 if I could find any takers. If you want to buy it for that price—" "Sold, my boy," the colonel said, slamming 3 bills down on the table. "I'll give that much for it, no matter how it works. The boys in the shop will get a kick out of it." He tapped the winged rocket on his chest. "Now really, what holds it up?" The demonstrator looked around carefully, then pointed. "Strings," he said. "Or rather, a black thread. It runs from the top of the model, through a tiny loop in the ceiling, and back down to my hand, tied to this ring on my finger. When I back up, the model rises. It's as simple as that." All good illusions are simple, the Colonel grunted, tracing the black thread with his eye, as long as there's plenty of flim-flam to distract the viewer. If you don't have a black table, a black cloth will do, the young man said, and the arch of a doorway is a good sight. Just see that the room in back is dark. Wrap it up, my boy. I wasn't born yesterday. I'm an old hand at this kind of thing. Biff Horton sprang it at the next Thursday night poker party. The gang were all missile men, and they cheered and jeered as he hammed up the introduction. Let me copy the diagram, Biff. I could use some of those magnetic waves in the new bird. Those flashlight batteries are cheaper than locks. This is the thing of the future. Only Teddy Kaner caught wise as the flight began. He was an amateur magician and spotted the gimmick at once. He kept silent with professional courtesy and smiled ironically as the rest of the bunch grew silent one by one. The Colonel was a good showman, and he had set the scene well. He almost had them believing in the space wave tapper before he was through. When the model had landed and he had switched it off, he couldn't stop them from crowding around the table. "A thread!" one of the engineers shouted, almost with relief, and they all laughed along with him. "Too bad," the head project physicist said. "I was hoping that a little space wave tapping could help us out. Let me try a flight with it." "Teddy Kaner first," Biff announced. "He spotted it while you were all watching the flashing lights, only he didn't say anything." Kaner slipped the ring with a black thread over his finger and started to step back. "You have to turn the switch on first," Biff said. "I know," Kaner smiled, "but that's part of the illusion. The spiel and the misdirection. I'm going to try this cold first, so I can get it moving up and down smoothly, then go through with the whole works." He moved his hand back smoothly, in a professional manner that drew no attention to it. The model lifted from the table, then crashed back down. "The thread broke," Kaner said. "You jerked it instead of pulling smoothly," Biff said, and knotted the broken thread. "Here, let me show you how to do it." The thread broke again when Biff tried it, which got a good laugh that made his collar a little warm. Someone mentioned the poker game. This was the only time that poker was mentioned or even remembered that night, because very soon after this, they found that the thread would lift the model only when the switch was on, and 2.5 volts flowing through the joke coils. With the current turned off, the model was too heavy to lift. The thread broke every time. "I still think it's a screwy idea," the young man said. "1 week getting full arches, demonstrating those toy ships for every brat within 1,000 miles, then selling the thing for $3 when they must have cost at least $100 apiece to make." "But you did sell the 10 of them to people who would be interested?" the older man asked. "I think so. I caught a few Air Force officers and a colonel in missiles one day. Then there was one official I remembered from the Bureau of Standards. Luckily, he didn't recognize me. Then those 2 professors you spotted from the university." "Then the problem is out of our hands and into theirs. All we have to do now is sit back and wait for results." "What results? These people weren't interested when we were hammering on their doors with the proof. We've patented the coils and can prove to anyone that there is a reduction in weight around them when they are operating. But a small reduction, and we don't know what is causing it. No one can be interested in a thing like that. A fractional weight decrease in a clumsy model, certainly not enough to lift the weight of the generator. No one wrapped up in massive fuel consumption, tons of lift and such, is going to have time to worry about a crackpot who thinks he has found a minor slip in Newton's laws." "You think they will now?" the young man asked, cracking his knuckles impatiently. "I know they will. The tensile strength of that thread is correctly adjusted to the weight of the model. The thread will break if you try to lift the model with it. Yet you can lift the model, after a small increment of its weight has been removed by the coils. This is going to bug these men. Nobody is going to ask them to solve the problem or concern themselves with it, but it will nag at them because they know this effect can't possibly exist. They'll see at once that the magnetic wave theory is nonsense. Or perhaps true, we don't know. But they will all be thinking about it and worrying about it. Someone is going to experiment in his basement, just as a hobby of course, to find the cause of the error, and he or someone else is going to find out what makes those coils work, or maybe a way to improve them. And we have the patents. Correct. They will be doing the research that will take them out of the massive lift propulsion business and into the field of pure spaceflight. And in doing so they will be making us rich whenever the time comes to manufacture, the young man said cynically. We'll all be rich, son, the older man said, patting him on the shoulder. Believe me, you're not going to recognize this old world 10 years from now.
The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. World Atavism by Edmond Hamilton, originally published in Amazing Stories, August 1930. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Foreword. I write these words in the room perched high in one of New York's highest towers. Beneath me, in the fading sunlight of late afternoon, there stretches the vast mass of the mighty city's structures. New York it is, but such a New York as never man looked upon before. And it is with its familiar but infinitely strange panorama before my eyes that I start now this record of the great change. My name is Alan Harker, Dr. Alan Harker, I could say, for it has been 7 years since I took the degree, and with it a position on the biological staff of Manhattan University. That was a great day for me. Manhattan was one of the most renowned of Eastern universities, and its biological department in particular was known to scientists the world over. This was due not only to the department's unrivaled equipment, but also in greater part to two of the scientists who worked in it, Dr. Howard Grant, head of the department, and Dr. Raymond Purcell, his associate. Very proud I was to have won so soon the opportunity of working with those two world-famed biologists. And even prouder I was when, in the next years, my work came gradually to link my name with theirs. Grant and Purcell and Harker. We were known to scientists across half the world. It was Grant, of course, the eldest of us, who was best known. A tall, saturnine-faced and dark-browed Scotsman, his utter and undivided passion for research was a byword among us. It used to be said, though not in his hearing, that Grant would have vivisected his own grandmother if he thought some new principle might be learned by it. All respected the man or the man's achievements, but he never had a tithe of the popularity that was Purcell's. Purcell was in fact a complete contrast to his superior, a short-statured man of middle age with unruly hair and beard, and warm, brown, friendly eyes. As for myself, the third of the trio, I had neither the brilliant scientific mind of Grant nor the keen vision of Purcell, but by dint of ceaseless plodding with monotonous details, I had built for myself a reputation that linked my name with theirs. Aside from our professorial duties in the university's lecture rooms, we had each of us our separate work. I was plodding away with my dull experiments on cell grouping, which I expected would some day yield a theory that would astound all cytologists. Now and then I received help on some difficult point from Purcell, who was himself immersed in an attempt to demolish the Snelson-Moores reverberation theory by prying into the interior structure of innumerable unheard-of lizards. Grant, however, never received or gave any help, keeping his work entirely to himself. He had gathered, from his rare references to it, that he had been working for months on one of the broader problems of evolutionary science, but that was all we knew, and we were as amazed as any when Grant published the statement that touched off the sensational evolution controversy. It is needless for me to give here all the details of the thing. It is sufficient to say that Grant, in his statement, announced that he had solved at last the greatest enigma of biological science, that he had discovered the cause of evolution. One can understand what an uproar that statement created, and was bound to create, for the cause of evolutionary change has always been the supreme problem of biology. Long ago, Darwin and Wallace and Lamarck and their fellows had laid the processes of evolution bare. They had shown to an astonished world what life on Earth was not static in forms that had always existed and always would exist, but that it was in constant change and movement up through constantly changing forms. The Eohippus had changed, had evolved into the horse, and in future ages would be something different still. The great felines that had roamed Earth had evolved into smaller forms and into tame cats. A certain branch of ape-like forms had evolved into great hairy troglodytes, and then into modern men. All life on Earth was constantly changing, evolving, forced ever upward through the diverging channels of evolution into new and different forms. But what force was it that pressed Earth's life thus upward through the paths of change? What force was it that caused all this vast, slow evolution of Earth's creatures into different creatures that had begun with the first jelly-like life forms on Earth, and had forced the tide of life up from them to the forms of today, that still was slowly changing them? That question none could answer. Environment did not explain it, for though environment had certain effects on the life forms in it, it was not responsible for that deep, vast tide of upward evolution. Mendelism had seemed for a time to suggest an explanation, but had failed in the end to do so. Some great force there was, all knew, that pressed life always up the path of evolution, but none had ever guessed what that force might be, and the thing had come to be accepted at last as one of the insoluble problems of science. And now Grant claimed that he had solved it. "For long," Grant's statement said, "I have held that since evolutionary change is unquestionably caused by some definite and omnipresent force acting upon all life on Earth, it should be possible to discover the nature of that force. I will not recount the works of months which I have spent in constant search for this force, but will say that finally I have been successful, have identified the force which my experiments show beyond all doubt to be the single force responsible for the upward course of evolution on Earth. That force is a vibratory force, a vibration unknown to Earth's physicists prior to my discovery of it, which has as its source the Sun. The Sun, we know, is a vast mass of incandescent matter which ceaselessly pours out part of its matter transformed into energy. The energy thus formed, flooding out in all directions from the Sun through space, takes various forms. At a certain vibratory frequency, it takes the form of light and illuminates our day. At another frequency, it is radiant heat warming our world. At still another, it is the cosmic ray so recently discovered. There are many others known to us, and still more of which we know nothing as yet, a vast welter of vibratory forces flooding endlessly outward from the Sun. And it is one of those vibrations,
one which we well may call the evolution vibration, which is responsible for the evolutionary change of all life on Earth. In this there is nothing astounding. The sun's various vibratory forces affect all living things on Earth profoundly, each in a different manner. Without the light vibrations, Earth's life would fade and die, the absence of the ultraviolet waves being fatal in time. Without its heat radiations, all life would freeze, and without this evolution vibration playing ceaselessly upon Earth, all life upon Earth would no longer be pressed upward through the paths of evolution, would slip back swiftly down those paths, down the myriad roads up which it has surged for so long. For not only is it this evolution vibration that forces Earth's life upward on the way of change, it is this vibration that keeps Earth's life from slipping backward. Thus for Grant's statement. To Purcell and me it was as astonishing as to the rest of the scientific world, for not until then did we learn what work it was that had occupied Grant for so long. Yet even we too, I think, were surprised at the sensation that the statement caused. Always the work of Dr. Grant had been accepted almost without question, so great was his reputation and so brilliant his achievements. But with the publication of this amazing new theory of his, the general dislike of the man that had always lain latent burst forth into a storm of criticism. It was admitted that the new vibratory force which Grant had discovered did apparently exist, since other scientists working on his data had corroborated his work on it. But it was denied, by Grant's numerous critics, that this force was what he claimed it to be, the cause of evolutionary change. It was impossible, they stated, that such a so-called evolution vibration could in reality be responsible for the course of evolution on Earth, and it was even more absurd to suggest, as Grant had done, that were that force withdrawn, were the evolution vibration to cease to play on Earth from the sun, the living beings of Earth would slip swiftly backward on the road of change. The controversy over the thing grew, in fact, to a point of bitterness unprecedented in scientific discussion, a bitterness intensified by the comments of the saturnine and black-tempered Grant. In a series of sardonic statements, he compared his critics to those who had derided the work of Darwin and his fellows, and indulged in some rather acrid personalities. These in turn provoked fiercer attacks, and the whole matter grew thus quickly into an unseemly intellectual brawl. To Purcell and myself, the whole controversy seemed a useless one, because, in the course of time, experimentation by other scientists would definitely prove or disprove Grant's theory. Yet neither of us ventured to suggest that to our bitter superior, and so the wrangle grew in intensity in the next days until it suddenly came to a head. It was the elderly President Rogers of Manhattan University who brought the thing into a focus. He and the university's other officials had been growing more and more restive under the criticisms that Grant's controversy was bringing on the school, and so at last he suggested that a meeting be held at which Grant could lay his theories and data before his fellow scientists in their entirety. This Grant accepted, and so too did most biologists of any note within travelling distance of New York, so widely had the clamour of the dispute spread. And on an afternoon Grant rose before several hundred assembled scientists in one of the university's lecture halls to explain his discovery. There is little need for me to tell at length of what took place at that meeting, which both Purcell and I attended. At the first appearance of Dr. Grant, his enemies in the audience grew vocal in their criticisms, and before he had spoken a quarter of an hour, the hall was in such an uproar as a scientific meeting has seldom heard. Twice Grant made an effort to go on, and each time his voice was drowned by a storm of shouted cries. The president, chairman of the meeting, was rapping vainly for order,
but Grant only stood still, looking out over the stormy meeting with a cold contempt in his eyes, yet with a strange fire in them. Quietly he rolled up the data sheets in his hand and thrust them into his pocket, and as quietly stepped forward to the platform's edge. Something in his bearing, in his expression, quickly quieted the noisy throng before him. His voice came out over the hall cold and clear. "You have not let me give to you the proof for which you asked," he said. The president stepped to his side, said something rapidly, but Grant shook his head calmly. "No proof that I can give you here would convince you of my theory's truth, I know," he told the silent throng before him. "But I will give you proof of it yet. To you and to the world, I will give a proof such as the world has never seen before." Before any could move, he had walked from the platform and out of the hall. A buzz of excited voices broke out instantly in comment and criticism. It was some hours later before Fersen and I got from the meeting to Grant's laboratory, but Grant was not there. Within 24 hours more we knew, and all at the university knew, that Dr. Grant had disappeared. From the meeting he went to his laboratory, burned some papers there, and pocketed others. Then he went to his rooms, hastily packed a few bags, and departed. He left no note, no message. His action brought to a climax the whole sensation of the controversy he had precipitated, and Grant's going was taken by many of his critics as a confession of the falsity of his position. He had had no close relatives to start to search for him, and though to Fersen and me his strange departure seemed astounding, we could explain it in no better than others. The sensation subsided, and Fersen was appointed to head the department in place of the vanished scientist. Our own work occupied us once more, and certainly neither Fersen nor I, any more than another, guessed what lay behind Grant's strange action. It was 6 months after Grant's departure that the great change began. The first intimation was brought to the public notice by a New York newspaper. In a sensational article entitled, "Is a New Crime Wave Upon Us?" it pointed out that in the last few days an unprecedented number of crimes of violence had taken place. These were the more appalling in that many seemed quite without motive. In New York alone, in those few days, there had been more than a dozen murders, mostly clubbings and stabbings, which had apparently been provoked by the slightest of causes. In Chicago, a respected clerk of middle age had for some annoyance turned suddenly and fractured the skulls of 3 of his associates with a heavy bar. From San Francisco and Los Angeles had come news of 6 holocausts in which one member of a family had slaughtered or attempted to slaughter all the others. From every part of the land there were coming reports of the most horrifying crimes of violence, the great majority of which seemed inspired by the pettiest of causes. And this same wave of homicidal mania seemed at work all over the world. It was as though hundreds in Earth's population had suddenly had their reason dwarfed and their passions magnified. No less than 3 solid householders in London had run amuck in bursts of sadistic fury that had cost 60 lives. The Paris police had taken from the Seine more human bodies, many terribly mutilated, than had ever been found in it in a like time before. Germany was aghast over 2 mass murders of unexampled fiendishness that had occurred in a Rhenish and a Silesian village. There was news of an even more terrible slaying in Calcutta, and word of murders almost as terrible from almost every country on the globe. Nor was it murder alone that was stalking the earth, for robberies of the utmost brutality were even more numerous. Overshadowed as they were by the greater horror, they were as astonishing in nature. For all, like the slayings, seemed the result of sudden brutal instincts or desires uncontrolled by reason. Small shopkeepers in American and English towns were struck down for trifles. In the stores of great cities there were those who snatched childishly at desired objects and attempted a hopeless escape to the street. That was the keynote of all these robberies, of all these crimes, the unreasoning childishness of them. For the great part of them were attempted under circumstances which should have shown to even the most dull-witted that there was no chance of success. It was a wave of strange and terrible crime, indeed, that was sweeping all over the earth. The newspapers concerned themselves with it to the exclusion of all else soon. They sought for explanations. What had caused this sudden release of the most brutal passions of numberless people? Many were the answers. An eminent scientist declared that the nerve-racking strain of modern civilization had reached such a pitch that the human mind could no longer stand it, was giving way beneath it. Many wrote serious letters to the press denouncing the motion pictures as schools of crime. Others defended them, and while the cause was thus argued, the great wave of crime and utter lawlessness that had rolled across earth seemed increasing in volume. The number of deaths by violence that were each day recorded had grown now to an appalling figure. Murderous attacks were common in every one of earth's great cities. Men hurled themselves at each other's throats, apparently for a word, a gesture. Nor was this all. A strange erratic insanity seemed seizing more and more of earth's millions. Numberless were those reported to the authorities as missing, those who had wandered causelessly away from home and family. The world's roads held an unprecedented number of vagrant wanderers. But in a few days more, even this astounding wave of appalling crime was dwarfed in importance by more astounding and more terrible happenings. Accidents, a great number of them fatal to many, were occurring in every part of earth in an amount that was all but incredible. More than 100 people had gone to death in the crash of 2 thundering passenger trains in Colorado, a crash that had been due to the failure of an engineer to heed the plainest of signals. 2 train wrecks in northern England had taken a toll of life almost as great, and there were reports of many other crashes from various parts of earth. In every one the accident had been due to the inexplicable failure of the human element, the failure of dispatcher or switchman or engineer to perform the duty that habit should have made automatic. In one case, that of the Austrian disaster, the crash had been directly caused by the sudden craziness of a switchman who, for some slight grievance, had sent a long passenger train crashing through an open switch and down an embankment. There was news as terrible from the seas. Wireless reports flashed thick with word of ships that had blundered fatally on rocks or shoals by fault of helmsman or navigating officer. The greater part of these, fortunately, were freight ships of medium and small size, but one case sent a thrill of horror through earth already steeped in horror. That was when the great transatlantic liner Garonia, bound to Southampton, crashed by night into the southern Irish coast with the resulting loss of 3/4 of the 1,000 humans it carried. And that wreck, like the others, was due to an utterly inexplicable failure of the ship's personnel. Smaller in magnitude, but taking a total of far more lives, were the unnumbered accidents that took place in the thickly populated and highly mechanized countries of North America and Europe. The number of automobile deaths, always staggering America, reached a stunning total in those last fateful days of September. Crashes took place at every corner, and the running down of pedestrians became a common occurrence everywhere. Many cars mowed a path of death through street and sidewalk before they were halted, their drivers losing apparently all faculty of control over them. And in mill and shop and factory, Death's grim hand was reaping as thickly. Men upon whom the lives of many depended suddenly lost control of their machines and sent those many to death. Countless others were mangled or crushed to death by the great mechanisms they had operated for years without mishaps. Airplane crashes became so numerous that many sections of the world peremptorily forbade all further flying until the cause of it all could be ascertained. It was as though more and more of the masses of men were becoming incapable of handling the mechanisms, of conducting the operations that they had been executing for years. Was mankind going collectively insane? It seemed insanity, indeed, that was sweeping Earth now. Riots had taken place on a small scale here and there in those days, but it was not until after the 1st of October that the first of the great outbreaks took place in London. Crowds of wondering men and women began the looting of shops, the breaking of windows, and the rioting swiftly spread. So swiftly did it spread, in fact, that by the time the troops called to suppress it appeared on the scene, unestimated thousands were engaged in the wild search for plunder. At the order to fire, an irregular volley from the troops killed scores, but in the pitched mob battle that followed, scores of the soldiers took the side of the looters. The combat between mob and soldier was forgotten, and the battle became a wild scene of brutality and violence in which hundreds were slain and trampled. In the end, it required machine guns to disperse them. A similar great outbreak in New York was curbed quickly a day later by the use of planes and tear bombs, but 2 days after there came a huge riot of unexampled bloodiness in Chicago, which cost several thousand lives, and which resulted in the burning of a third of the city. Beginning as a race riot and developing into a savage general battle for loot, it was notable for the fact that the troops, called to suppress it, broke up even before they reached the scene and occupied themselves in brutal looting and battle of their own. And a score of great riots in the other cities of Earth had similar results. Civilization seemed crashing with this oncoming dissolution of its organization and institutions. Had humanity gone insane indeed? Swiftly, with full realization of the peril upon it by then, a conference of the world's most noted scientists had been called some days before at New York to explain and to halt, if possible, this wave of seeming insanity that was gripping more of the masses of humanity each day, and that was disintegrating civilization. But when those scientists met, the world learned that they had 100 different explanations of the thing, no two agreeing. The famous American alienist who had voiced his opinion days before reiterated his belief that the minds of men were giving way en masse beneath the strain of modern civilization. A Romanian bacteriologist claimed that the thing was a result of a contagious new brain disease spreading over Earth, and claimed even to have isolated the bacterium of that disease. The scientists, gripped seemingly by something of the erratic condition of mind they were striving to explain, argued these theories and others with utmost passion, sometimes attacking each other. An English physicist, who suggested that Earth was passing through strange mind-affecting gases in space, was assaulted by the proponent of another theory. And still more furious and incredulous, the world learned, was a reception given to the explanation of a New York biologist named Purcell, who claimed that the whole great terror was a result of the human race's slipping backward on the road of evolution. World Atavism, a throwback of all the world's life on the road of evolution. So they learned. Purcell had cried to the assembled scientists, all Earth's animal life is beginning to slip back, and man, as the most recently developed animal, is slipping first, is going back toward the savage state, toward the caveman or troglodyte, toward the ape. He is losing control of his passions as he goes back, which accounts for the violence that now fills Earth. And he is losing the mental capacity of modern man, which accounts for his inability to operate longer on modern machines. A world atavism that is beginning with the atavism of the human races." "But what could cause such world atavism as that?" the incredulous scientists had cried. "The evolutionary theory of my former associate, Dr. Grant," Fersen had begun, but was interrupted by a chorus of derisive shouts provoked by the mention of the scientist whose ridiculous theory had been exploded. So Fersen had been forced from the meeting by the furious scientists, who seemed seized indeed with the erratic craziness that was gripping the world. Another day they advanced and argued their theories that grew ever more impossible, more incoherent, and then the meeting dissolved in a general riotous brawl of the arguing scientists. They, in common with the rest of the races of men, seemed incapable longer of calm thought, of cool, unpassioned reasoning. 2 were killed, throttled in the brawl that ended the meeting, and the rest scattered. They were not followed or punished, for now the disintegration of humanity's institutions had become such that crime was unheeded. Men were out-rivaling each other in mad action. Those in high places as in low were gripped by the insanity that apparently seized Earth, and from the cabinets and congresses of a score of nations came declarations of war against other nations for the slightest of reasons, or for none at all. England, the United States, France, Germany, Italy, Turkey, Japan, and China, these and a dozen others issued frenzied and incoherent calls to arms. But they were unheeded. Even war now could not penetrate the unreasoning minds of men. Armies had broken up, all discipline and organization vanishing. A few who tried to keep their soldiers in line found that the men could no longer handle the great guns and instruments of war, found that most of them were incapable of the operation of rifles. Civilization was crashing with a prolonged roar of falling laws and institutions and customs echoing across the world. The ordinary methods of transportation and production having completely broken down days before, the stream of food into the great cities had abruptly ceased. The brutal throngs that filled those cities subsisted by looting the existing food supplies for a time, but soon these were exhausted, and then terrible battles took place between the rioters for food which they had found. Battles there were of hordes of ragged brutes, of savages, who fought with knives or with their bare hands in the streets. Only occasionally was a shot heard, for almost none there was now with sufficient dull glimmer of intelligence to manipulate a gun. In the shadow of the tall towers of New York, and in the brick and stone acres of London and the boulevards of Paris, thousands and hundreds of thousands of these savages swarmed, the ways choked with corpses of the slain. At night they crouched fearfully in hallways and offices and corridors, the vast cities lying dark and silent beneath the stars. Shapes of prowling animals were being seen in some of them by night. No wheel turned in all the world now, for none seemed left with intelligence enough to operate the simplest machine. And these swarms that had been human were changing in appearance too. The men were unshaven and hairier, it seemed. Much clothing had been discarded, crude belts that held knives or the like weapons being retained. They crouched now as they walked, their step a watchful, animal-like one. From under shaggy brows they stared at each other. Small, crude family groups held together, the man battling other men for the possession of food. Some managed to kill animals and wore the skins. They were troglodytes, millions of them, men such as the world had seen thousands of years before, as humanity had been then. They were troglodytes, wandering through the cities and towns that they themselves had built, staring in wondering fear about them at things the purpose of which they could not understand. But most had no wonder, only a brutal lack of interest in all save food and mating and sleep. There were no fires, for all had lost the use of fire and feared it now. Driven by hunger, great masses of them were pouring out of the cities into the countryside to hunt roots and herbs and to kill small animals for food. They made rude shelters for a time, then abandoned them for caves and crannies in the rocks. They ceased to use knives or spears. They could but throw great stones at each other, or wield chance clubs, or fight with bare hands. Many had remained in the cities, and among them was more fighting. With each day they were changing farther, it seemed, going farther back along the long road of change that man had ascended so slowly through the ages, and that he was slipping back upon so swiftly. The streets of New York and Glasgow and Constantinople and Yokohama saw them, these animal-like, ape-like hordes that wandered there. Ape-like they were becoming, indeed, swiftly hairier of body, more crouching of gait, stooping occasionally and moving to run on hands and feet. Clothing they had discarded. The fragmentary mumbled speech that they had kept until days before had given way to a meaningless medley of barking, shouts, and cries whose tone conveyed their crude attempt at communication. They roamed the great cities in little groups or tribes, of each of which one was the strongest, the tyrant, the acknowledged lord. And now they were changing still, were running more on hands and feet, walking upright less. Back from man to troglodyte, and from troglodyte to ape had the human races gone, and now were slipping back still into the animal races from which the apes had come. World atavism, and it was wiping the last human-like forms from the face of earth. Of this great change that in days swept man back to the brutal forms of dead ages, I, Alan Harker, was a witness from the first. For it was at New York that the early manifestations of the change had been first noticed, in that increasing wave of terrible crime that was in days to rage over the whole earth. Neither Thurston nor I, of course, had any suspicion of the thing's real magnitude in those first days. We followed, with the same astonishment that held most in the world, the astounding growth of crime and violence, but it was remote from our own interests, and we were both very much absorbed in our differing work of experimentation. We spent more time on that work, indeed, in those days than before, for both Thurston and I seemed to have lost a little of our usual skill and knowledge. I know that he caught himself in inexplicable lapses, and I know that I, usually the most patient of biologists, forgot myself in sudden impatient rage on one or two occasions, and smashed retorts and test tubes about me. Neither of us dreamed, of course, that we were being affected by the same strange forces that were releasing humanity's passions in a carnival of crime. But when a little later the great wave of crime that was making Earth hideous was made more terrible by the innumerable inexplicable accidents that were occurring, Thurston became thoughtful. He deserted his own white-tiled laboratories for the university's psychological test rooms with their strange recording instruments, and spent hours there carrying out intricate tests of the reactions of himself and others. It was after 2 days of such tests, when the fatal accidents occurring everywhere were taking toll of thousands of lives daily, and when almost all industrial activity was slowing and stopping because of them, that Thurston came back, his countenance as I had never seen it. "I have found it, Alan," he said quietly, "the cause of all this terror, these innumerable crimes and accidents and riotings." "The cause of them?" I repeated, uncomprehendingly, and he nodded. "Yes, and that cause is world atavism. An atavism, a throwback of all the world's animal life, that is beginning with man as the most recently developed animal, and that is taking place before our eyes, taking place in ourselves even. World atavism, I gasped. But Fersen, that such a thing could be. It's inconceivable. He shook his head. Not inconceivable. You remember Grant and his theory that the evolution vibrations from the sun were what had pushed Earth's life up the road of evolution? And you remember that Grant said that there were those evolution vibrations to cease to reach Earth from the sun, all Earth's life would slip swiftly back upon that road? I remember, I said. But how could such a thing happen? What could ever halt the play of the sun's evolution vibrations on Earth? Fersen's eyes were sombre. I do not know what could, he said slowly, but I think I know who could. Fersen, I cried, you don't for an instant think that Grant? I do think so, he said, his voice steely. Grant discovered the existence of the evolution vibrations. He alone of men knew all concerning them. Do you remember what he said when they refused to let him explain his theory even at that meeting? He said, I will give you proof of this. I will give you proof yet of this theory, and such a proof as the world has never seen before. My mind was reeling. Then you think that when Grant disappeared, that he... I think that the great proof that Grant promised in his rage to give the world is the world atavism that is upon humanity now. I think that Grant in some inconceivable way has used his knowledge and his power to deflect or dampen the evolution vibrations coming toward Earth from the sun, and that it is because of the absence of those vibrations that Earth's life is slipping backward. But where will it stop? I exclaimed. It will not stop, Harker. This tremendous change has only begun. Man, the most recently evolved of all animals, is changing first, and will go back through troglodyte and ape to the forms before them, back through changing beast forms. By then, the other animals of Earth will be changing also, thrown back along the evolutionary road, and that great atavism will continue until Earth's life has all changed back into the first crude protoplasmic forms from which eons ago it sprung. But what can we do? I cried. There must be some way of stopping this. There is only one way, he said. Grant is causing this great world atavism, is shutting off the sun's evolution vibrations from Earth by projecting toward the sun, no doubt, a great dampening or neutralizing vibration that stifles them, annihilates them at their source. We must find Grant's whereabouts, must destroy whatever apparatus he is using to do that. Yet, if all are changing, we too also must be changing, I exclaimed, and he nodded. We too are already a little affected, as all men are, more or less. Our lapses of memory, the difficulties we have in our work now, these things in the last days are the result of this world atavism in us, just as the crimes and accidents filling Earth are. And we too must protect ourselves against this tremendous change, whatever we do, for on us depends the one chance of halting Grant's terrible work. The world will never believe that the dread work is really going on until it's too late, so you and I must not change. Fersen went swiftly on to explain his idea. This was none other than to construct 2 small projectors that would each automatically and ceaselessly generate artificial evolution vibrations, vibrations affecting a limited range as the sun's vibrations had affected all Earth. These projectors, in their compact cases, could be worn on our bodies by each of us without being noticeable, and would keep each of us always thus in the range of the vital vibrations, so that we would not be affected by the worldwide absence of that which was causing this world atavism. Whatever great dampening wave Grant was sending out toward the sun to neutralize its evolution vibrations would not, of course, affect the vibrations of our own little projectors. The next 2 days saw us at work upon these projectors. The method of producing the evolution vibrations we knew, for as I have mentioned, they had been artificially produced in a small way by physicists upon Grant's first announcement of his theory. The second day, therefore, saw our projectors complete, small, flat, black cases that were strapped to our belts without being noticeable, each holding the tiny but marvellously powerful batteries that were the current source, and the compact little generator that automatically and unendingly released the vital evolution vibrations for a range of several feet. With these completed and working, and secured thus by them from being ourselves affected by the terrible atavism that was upon the races of man, we began our greater work of locating Grant and the apparatus by which he was shutting off the sun's vibrations and loosing this horror on the earth. For horror it had now become, and the world was waking up to its true nature as every sort of brutal passion was released in terrible crime over it, and as the inexplicable mindlessness of men brought on terrific accidents. Already a dozen of the greatest governments in cooperation had called a conference of Earth's greatest scientists at New York to explain, or to halt at least, the horror that was sweeping Earth. To that conference they came with each a different and more incredible explanation of the thing, and to it went Purcell and I to give them the true explanation, and to turn them toward the search for Grant that might yet save humanity. But that explanation was never given, for Purcell's first mention of world atavism was greeted with incredulous cries, and when he went on to mention Grant, such a derisive storm arose that he was forced bodily from the meeting, leaving the scientists disputing fiercely over the most impossible of theories, supporting and opposing those theories by blows. For they, like the rest of humanity, seemed incapable now of clear and sustained thought upon any subject. Even Purcell and I, working day and night in the isolated Upper Manhattan laboratories of the university, were able to see clearly what was happening about us. We were living, eating, sleeping at the laboratories by this time, for all means of transportation and all industrial activities were ceasing. Great masses of men roamed the streets of the city, some forming into gangs that made life terrible for the others, the rest engaged in indiscriminate looting. The great London riot and the abortive outbreak in Lower New York had now taken place, and it was evident to all that the last shadow of law and order in the city was vanishing, for more and more the troops and police who maintained it were engaging in the rioting themselves. News came, still a little, in incoherently written and erratically printed sheets, for a few days, and it was thus we learned of the huge Chicago riot and subsequent fire. It marked the beginning of the end. Within a few days more, utter lawlessness reigned over New York. Corpses lay in its streets, and looters were everywhere. The university buildings, deserted now by all but ourselves, were not attacked, except on a few occasions by the looting swarms, there being no food or other desirable things in them, and Purcell and I had rifles and pistols in our laboratory to repel the ragged and brutal gangs that might attack us. In those terrible days we were occupied heart and soul in the work of locating Grant and whatever mechanism it was by which he was casting his doom on humanity. It was Purcell's idea that the great dampening wave, which Grant must be sending toward the sun to halt the play of its endless evolution vibrations, would affect certain recording instruments, if the correct frequency for their circuits could be found. Once that was found, by observing the amount by which the instruments were affected at different locations by the waves of the great damping vibration, we could calculate and chart that great wave's source with some degree of accuracy. It seemed to me a very slender chance, yet I knew as well as did Purcell that it was the one possible way. Grant, we knew, would have protected himself, as we had, by a small artificial projector of the vibrations. So in those fearful days we worked with the recording instruments, watching them at each new trial for some indication of the force whose source we sought. The whole great mass of New York's giant structures that stretched southward and downward from our laboratory lay now in complete darkness each night, the last wonted activities of civilization having ceased in it as elsewhere. Ragged hordes of savages roamed it, savages so hairy and crouching and brutal of face, seeming each day more prognathous of jaw and slanting of brow and animal-like of eye, that we knew them to be troglodytes, cavemen, men such as humanity had been ages before, and such as it was over all earth now. We saw them occasionally prowling through the university grounds in search of food, shambling toward us with lowering brows to attack us when they glimpsed us, but fleeing in fear when we fired over their heads. For none of them could manipulate so complicated a thing as a firearm. All Earth's hundreds of millions were prowling their way in just such brutal bands, thrown back to the state that had been man's before history's dawn. And ever more brutal and hairy and animal-like they were becoming as they slipped back farther still, back from troglodyte to ape. Mankind was gone, transformed into these still changing brutes, all except Fersen and me. I cannot tell now in full of those terrible last days of change, those days in which in our trance glimpses we saw men making that other terrible step backward from troglodyte to ape. For Fersen and I were working with the speed of utter despair. Even were Grant's terrible work to be halted, the sun's evolution vibrations again released on Earth, it would take them untold ages to raise the brute-like beings about us to the status of men once more. Humanity was passing, had passed, into the brute around us. Yet for their sake, for the sake of the humanity that might again rise in the dim future, we kept to our efforts, sought still to halt this awful change that would otherwise not stop until protoplasmic slime alone was left living on Earth. We had found the correct frequency for the circuits of our recording instruments, and in feverish haste set up those instruments at intervals of a mile, working through the night. The weirdest of work it was, the vast city's streets and structures silent in the night around us, the countless hordes of brute-like beings that once had built them, now cowering in their buildings in ape-like fear of the night's mysteries. We took our readings, hastened back to our laboratory, and dawn found us marking those readings on the great chart map of the section we had ready. Somewhere in that section, somewhere near New York, we knew, Grant lurked with his terrible mechanism, our first readings having shown us that. And now, as with trembling hands Fersen and I drew the graphs on the big chart, we stared for a moment after in complete silence. Those lines converged at a point in a midtown block of the great city south of us, a block occupied by a single gigantic building, whose aspiring tower was in sight of our laboratory's windows. For moments, Fersen and I stared from chart to tower in silence, and then without words we had turned, seen to the filled magazines of the pistols at our belts, and were passing out of the laboratory into the bright sunlight. As silent as ever, we started southward. Never, were my existence extended 1,000 years, could there be blotted from my memory that journey southward through the silent towers of New York that Fersen and I made then. For the great city that lay silent about us beneath the brilliant noon sunshine was a city of horror unutterable. Dead lay thick in its streets, and great dogs, already strange and fierce and wolf-like, ran in packs among them. The rusting wrecks of smashed automobiles were piled at every corner. No window of all we passed remained intact. Sidewalks and streets were sprinkled with shivered glass. Westward, across the river, a great fire was burning in the cities there, pouring a black volume of flame-laced smoke up to the skies. But more terrible than all of these things were the hordes, the swarms of creatures that moved through the streets and ways about us, the countless creatures that once had been the city's people. Great ape-like creatures they were, not apes such as men had known, but ape-like races such as men had sprung from eons before. In groups and packs of scores they roamed the city's ways. Covered with thick hair, stooped and crouching of gait, the garments that they had worn as men torn and discarded, there was in them no semblance to humanity. They walked stiffly toward each other, stooping to rest hairy forearms on the ground each few steps. They growled and barked in rage, or chattered volubly and meaninglessly. The majority were prowling in wrecked stores for fragments of food. Others moved along the streets in a search for small animals, for insects even. Growling in rage, their groups came toward Thurston and me as we moved onward, but each time a pistol shot sent them fleeing from us. We moved on, never speaking. Thurston's face icy calm, my own brain reeling. We came at last to the base of the giant building that we knew must hold whatever mechanism Grant was using to withhold the evolution vibrations from the earth. Thurston turned to speak to me for the first time. "Somewhere in there," he whispered. "We must search, Harker, to find Grant's apparatus." "And if he is with it?" I asked, but his only answer was to tighten his grip on the pistol in his hand. We passed into the great building's marble entrance hall, a place of dim shadows, through which we stumbled over prostrate dead. We went quickly through the looted, wrecked rooms that had been the luxurious shops of its first level. Then the stairs, and we were going upward, level after level, searching through the immense building's numberless offices and rooms. In one or two were dead, and some had been wrecked, but in none, in no part of the building, it seemed, were any of the ape-like throngs. That seemed encouraging, somehow, and with beating hearts we pressed on upward. Level after level, we were high in the immense building. Its floors here were smaller of extent because of its pyramidal form. Yet there was no sound from the shadows about us, no sign of what we sought. Despair was growing in us, for we were high in the great tower that was the building's uppermost part, and had found nothing. Through the shadowy halls we pressed still, and through the silent rooms lit with the gold of the westward swinging sun. But as we moved up the narrow stair toward the last and highest level of the great tower, something flamed in Thurston's eyes as in mine. A sound had come from above to our ears, a steady, slow clicking as of a great clock. Pistols in hand, we moved up, found ourselves in a small hall at the tower's side. The unused elevator shaft was beside us, and the stairs that led to the roof. But before us was the single door that gave access, apparently, to the whole space of the tower's uppermost level, and from behind it came the slow clicking to our ears. As one, we crossed the hall toward that door. Thurston's hand on its knob turned slowly, and slowly, astoundingly, the door swung open. Our pistols lowered for the moment in our amazement. We stepped through, stopped. A dozen feet before us stood Grant, a heavy automatic in his hand, trained upon us. Silence. In it, Grant's eyes held ours. His dark-browed, powerful face was lit with unholy triumph, with sardonic exultation. I saw that before us was the whole space of the tower's highest level, thrown into one great room. Huge, black-cased and powerful batteries were ranged upon each other in scores at one side of the room. Armoured cables led from them through incalculable generators and transformers to a great object at the big room's centre. It was like a giant searchlight, a dozen feet or more in diameter, swung in a frame resembling gimbals, so that it could be turned in any direction. The 12-foot disc inside it glowed silently with white light, and the great thing was turned to face exactly the sinking sun westward. It was slowly following the descending sun, turning slowly under the action of a great clock mechanism whose clicking was loud in our ears still. Grant, Fersen, and I, we were silent there in the room, all motionless, until Grant spoke. His voice was metallic, controlled, mocking. "Fersen and Harker," he was saying. "Fersen and Harker, who believed in my theory, my power, it seems, when none else on earth did, who made projectors like the one that I wear, and have escaped the world doom that I have released, have escaped, and have come in search of me, with pistols in their hands even." My brain was racing. I knew that to lift the arms in our grasp meant instant death. Grant's sardonic mirth lashed suddenly out in scorn. "To come through the city toward this building, firing shots," he mocked. "Shots that made those brute swarms beneath us flee, but that warned me at the same time of your coming. To steal clumsily in upon me that way, thinking to surprise me and halt the work that has not yet finished." "That work has gone on too long, Grant," said Fersen slowly, his voice strange. "It cannot go on longer." "Cannot?" came the bitter voice. "You mistake, Fersen. It must and shall. What are they now but brutes, animals? The world of men that derided and refused my work, that might have transformed them into gods. Brutes, and even more brutal shall they become, going down through form after form to the first protoplasm. They asked for proof. I have given the world proof, have thrown back humanity eons on the road of progress, and I will throw them and all Earth's life back farther still. This great projector. It is worth the months it took to build it, months that I toiled here and posed as a scientist studying electrical phenomena, working to finish the projector at last and turn its great damping vibration toward the sun in a mighty ray. A vibration tuned to neutralize and destroy that part of the sun's evolution vibrations radiating toward Earth. You have lost, Fersen. Harker, for you both die this moment, and this projector shall continue to withhold the evolution vibrations from Earth until its life has been thrown back in this world atavism into the primal protoplasm, until I alone am left living upon—" His pistol roared, for it was at that instant that Fersen leaped. But even the bullet could not halt Fersen's rush, so swift and unexpected was it, and he struck Grant, knocked him back. I leaped toward the projector. Grant's pistol was detonating even as he was knocked back, though, and halfway to the machine something seemed to strike me 2 swift, smashing blows beneath the shoulder. I swayed, staggered on to the projector, was beneath it and reaching toward the cables leading into it. Grant was springing toward me, his pistol at my head, but behind him Fersen, blood on his lips and on his breast, half raised himself, the pistol in his hand, speaking. At its crack Grant swayed, collapsed and fell, the black compact case at his belt that had preserved him breaking loose as he struck the floor. Fersen, leaning, had his dimming eyes upon me, striving to speak. I reached, grasped the cables, tore at them once, twice, and then they had ripped loose. The white light of the disk inside the great projector vanished, and the mechanism that moved it ceased its clicking. The world atavism that had thrown the races of man back to the state that had been theirs eons before was ended at last. Fersen, his eyes on mine, seemed to smile feebly in approval. Then his body slipped quietly down, and he lay as motionless and silent as Grant. Afterward. I have been writing here in this silent room for a time, whose length I cannot guess. Westward, though, the sun is touching the horizon, its level rays searching through this room over the great projector and over Fersen and Grant lying silent before me. My life is ebbing swiftly from me with each passing minute, yet with the age-old instinct of man strong in me, I have striven thus to leave a record of the great change, that men of the future in some far day may read. Men of the future. For there will be such, there must be such. The upward surge of evolutionary progress that had been interrupted, set back here on Earth, begins again its slow upward climb with the halting of this projector, the coming again of the evolution vibrations that are now playing on Earth again. Beneath me, in the silent city, there swarm the ape-like hordes that were once humanity, but through the coming ages they will climb up again through troglodyte and savage barbarian to man. And it is for those men of the far future that I have written with my last strength these words, as a record and a warning that I shall enclose in the steel box beside me. A warning that their civilization be never cast back from man to brute as ours has been. And if God send that they heed that warning, none among them ever shall die as I die now, the last man of all men, looking down through the sunset into the familiar but infinitely strange city where roamed the hordes that once were men. Sunset. Sunset for our civilization, our races, as for the earth. But, dying, I know that after their passing there must come with the slow upward climb of evolution new races, new civilizations, as surely as after sunset and night must come The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. Every single day.